ATA for escaping my marriage like a prison? I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd feel trapped in her own marriage. Growing up, I used to roll my eyes at those dramatic TV shows where the wife whispers, "I feel like a prisoner in my own home." I thought, come on, how could anyone not see the red flags before it got that bad? But here I am, 34 years old, and I've become exactly that woman. To the outside world, I'm the picture-perfect wife of Daniel, my 36-year-old husband. If you ask anyone else, they'll tell you I'm so lucky to be married to him. He's charming, successful, the kind of man who walks into a room and people instantly gravitate toward. He's the one cracking jokes at dinner parties, remembering everyone's names, pulling out chairs for old ladies, tipping the waiter double. People adore him, but those same people never see what happens when the doors close. Inside my house, our house, he doesn't feel like a husband. He feels like a warden. When I first met Daniel, I won't lie, he swept me off my feet. He had this confidence about him that I mistook for security. At the time, I was fresh out of a long relationship with someone who was indecisive, flaky, always leaving me second-guessing. Daniel was the opposite. He knew what he wanted, and he wasn't afraid to say it. I remember our first date. We met at this little Italian restaurant downtown. He showed up in a navy suit, even though I later found out he came straight from work. He ordered for both of us without asking, and I laughed about it at the time. "Wow," I said, "aren't you a little presumptuous?" And he just smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I just know it's good here. Trust me." Back then, it felt charming. Like he was taking care of me. Like I could finally relax and let someone else steer for once. What I didn't realize is that moment was the blueprint for our entire relationship. At first, it was subtle. He'd suggest I stop hanging out with certain friends. "They don't really bring you joy, do they?" he'd say. Or, "They're jealous of us, babe." I can see it. Then it became about work. I was a teacher, and I loved it. The chaos of kids, the smell of markers, the satisfaction of seeing a light bulb go off in someone's eyes when they finally got something, it made me feel alive. But Daniel had other ideas. "Why do you need to work?" he'd ask, slipping his arm around me on the couch. "I make enough for both of us. You could focus on your art, or just relax." Isn't that every woman's dream? I resisted at first. I told him teaching wasn't just a job, it was part of who I was. But he chipped away at me. He'd bring it up after rough days, pointing out how stressed I looked. He'd casually mention how much money he made compared to my salary, like it was a joke. Eventually, I started to feel guilty, like maybe I was being selfish for wanting something of my own. So I quit. And that's when the walls really closed in. When you don't have your own income, something changes. At least, it did with Daniel. Suddenly, everything was his. His house, his money, his rules. At first, he'd frame it as generosity. "Here, take my card if you need anything." But there was always this invisible leash attached. If I bought something he didn't approve of, he'd raise an eyebrow. "Did you really need that?" he'd ask, half smiling. I started second-guessing every purchase. Groceries, clothes, even coffee. I felt like a teenager sneaking around, only instead of hiding cigarettes or bad report cards, I was hiding receipts. It got to the point where I'd stand in front of the mirror before leaving the house, rehearsing excuses in case he asked why I needed a new blouse. And friends? Forget it. One by one, they drifted away. Not because they didn't care, but because I stopped showing up. Daniel always had a reason. He'd plan something the same night as a girls' dinner. Or he'd guilt me with lines like, "Why do you want to spend time with them when you could be with me?" I told myself it was just part of marriage. Compromise. Sacrifice. But inside, I felt smaller and smaller until one day, I barely recognized myself. The strangest part of all this? To the outside world, I was still lucky. Neighbors saw me driving around in Daniel's luxury car and thought I had it made. My family bragged about how well I wanted to scream, "You don't see it. You don't see what he's really like." But how could I? Even I couldn't fully name it yet. Instead, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I was there, but not really. My voice didn't matter. My choices didn't matter. Even my dreams didn't matter. And that's when the real darkness began to creep in, the part of me that started to believe maybe this was all I deserved. One night, everything shifted, though not in the way you might expect. Daniel and I were at a dinner party with some of his colleagues. He was in full performance mode, cracking jokes, making people roar with laughter. At one point, someone asked me about my job, and I froze. I didn't have a job anymore. I laughed nervously and said, "Oh, I used to teach, but now I'm just at home." Just at home. That's what came out of my mouth. Like I was nothing. Like my whole existence had been reduced to nothing. And Daniel? He just grinned, squeezing my hand under the table. "She doesn't need to work," he said proudly. "I take care of everything." Everyone nodded approvingly, like it was some fairy tale. And I smiled too, but inside, something cracked. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't living. I was surviving. And barely at that. That was the night I stopped pretending I was happy. That was the night I started plotting my way out. But trust me, the way I finally escaped Daniel, it wasn't anything like I planned. And it sure as hell wasn't something he or anyone else ever saw coming. Daniel was the type of man who checked everything. My phone, my emails, even my browser history. Once, I forgot to close a tab for a recipe blog, and he accused me of wasting time online. After that, I knew better than to risk leaving any trace of my thoughts. So I built a journal in my head. It started small, tiny notes I'd repeat to myself until they stuck. Like how he reused the same password for his work emails and our streaming account. Or how he always came home late on Thursdays because of his weekly client dinners. Or how the basement door stuck just slightly when you pulled it a certain way. Little things. Unimportant things. At least, that's what they looked like on the surface. But to me, each detail was a stone I was prying loose from the wall of my prison. I knew I couldn't let Daniel suspect anything. If I was going to escape, it had to be quiet, methodical, invisible. So I leaned into the role of the obedient wife. I cooked his favorite meals. I laughed at his jokes, even when they made my skin crawl. I pretended to hang on every word of his rants about work. I even let him pick out my clothes, nodding like I really believed him when he said, "This dress makes you look classy." All the while, in my head, I was digging. Digging with every detail I stored away. I think that's what kept me sane. Knowing that while he thought I was under his thumb, I was secretly chiseling away at the bars. One afternoon, while I was tending to the flower bed out front, our neighbor, an older woman named Marjorie, leaned over the fence. She tilted her head, studying me. "Honey," she said softly, "are you okay?" My heart stopped. It was such a simple question, but it nearly cracked me wide open. For a moment, I wanted to spill everything. To tell her how I felt like a ghost, how I hadn't bought my own clothes in years, how I couldn't even drink a cup of coffee without worrying if Daniel would notice. But instead, I forced a smile. "Of course," I said, "just a little tired." She looked at me like she didn't quite believe it, but she let it go. And I swore to myself right then, no one could know. Not her, not my sister, not even my best friend. Because if Daniel caught wind of what I was planning, even the slightest hint, I knew it would all be over. The details I kept in my mental journal started forming a pattern. His passwords meant I could access his work schedule, bank information, even his travel plans. His routine meant I knew exactly when the house would be empty and for how long. That loose tile in the basement? It became my secret hiding spot for anything small I couldn't risk him finding, like the spare keys I'd copied when he wasn't paying attention, or the prepaid phone I bought with cash. Every little thing was another tool in my invisible toolkit. The basement especially became symbolic to me. Daniel hated that part of the house, said it was unfinished, ugly. But to me, it was freedom. That loose tile was my tunnel, my Shawshank Redemption moment, except instead of carving through concrete, I was carving through lies and control. Keeping everything bottled up wasn't easy. There were nights I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body vibrating with the need to tell someone. Just to hear another human voice say, "You're not crazy. You're not alone." But I never did. Silence became its own kind of armor. If Daniel was the warden of my prison, then silence was the key I kept hidden under my tongue. Because if I wanted to escape, I couldn't just run blindly into the night. That's what he expected. That's what every abuser expects, that you'll panic, make mistakes, get caught, and crawl back broken. No, I was going to outsmart him. I was going to walk out of that house like I was never meant to stay. I think this was the part of the story where something inside me hardened. Up until then, I'd been surviving day by day. Numb, ghost-like. But once I started keeping that mental journal, once I started piecing together my escape, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Even if it was secret, even if it was small, it was mine. And with every detail I memorized, every plan I rehearsed, every smile I faked while hiding the truth behind my teeth, I felt myself inching closer to freedom. What I didn't realize then, though, was that the real danger wasn't in the planning. The real danger was that Daniel was smarter than I gave him credit for. And one night, he almost caught me. I crept down to the basement barefoot, careful not to let the stairs creak. My heart hammered in my chest, every beat screaming, this is it. This is where I get caught. He's going to wake up. He's going to find me. But he didn't. I reached the far wall, the one Daniel never paid attention to. And there it was, the loose tile. I'd discovered it months earlier, just a tiny wobble when I brushed against it while doing laundry. He'd never cared enough to fix it. To him, it was nothing. To me, it was everything. I pried it loose with shaking fingers, my breath shallow. Behind it, there was a hollow space. Not huge, but deep enough to hide something important. And right then, it felt like I was staring into my own escape tunnel. It started small. A few dollars from the grocery money, just enough that he wouldn't notice. I'd slip it behind the tile, whispering to myself, one day this will matter. Then came the documents. Copies of my birth certificate, my social security card, even our marriage license. I couldn't risk the originals. They were locked in his office safe. But copies would be better than nothing if I had to prove who I was. And then, the biggest risk of all, a prepaid phone. I bought it with cash on a rare trip to the store alone, and the entire time I felt like the clerk could see right through me. But I got it home, slid it behind the tile, and felt a surge of victory. Piece by piece, my hollow space became more than just a hiding spot. It became my lifeline. Upstairs, nothing changed. I played the role of the perfect wife, just like always. I smiled through dinners, laughed at his jokes, and nodded along when he bragged to friends about how well I lived. To Daniel, I was still obedient. To me, I was a thief stealing back my own life. Every time I slid something new behind that tile, I felt lighter, stronger, more in control. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My plan was simple, at least in theory. One day, while Daniel was at work, I'd take what I'd stashed, walk out the door, and never come back. No dramatic goodbye, no confrontation, just gone. I fantasized about it constantly, packing a bag, grabbing my hollow stash, and stepping into a world where no one called me, just at home. A world where I didn't have to rehearse excuses for why I needed a new blouse. A world where I could finally breathe. But of course, life doesn't follow clean plans. Because just when I thought I had everything under control, something happened that threw everything into chaos. It was a Tuesday. Daniel came home early. His face was flushed, his movements sharp. He slammed his briefcase on the counter, muttering about a deal gone wrong. I froze, my body instinctively bracing for the storm. But instead of yelling, he stopped and stared at me. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his eyes narrowing. Too quiet. My mouth went dry. "Just tired," I murmured, forcing a smile. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Don't get any ideas, sweetheart. You've got a good life here. Better than most." And then, just like that, he turned away, pouring himself a drink. But my blood ran cold. Because the way he said it, the sharp edge in his tone, it was like he already knew something. Like he could smell my secret, even if he hadn't found the hollow space. That was the night I realized my escape wasn't going to be as simple as walking out the door. That was the night the game changed. Because Daniel wasn't just the warden of my prison. He was starting to suspect I was building a way out. By the time I reached the night before my planned escape, I thought I had every detail lined up. The stash behind the basement tile, the prepaid phone, the copies of documents, the perfect window of time when Daniel would be gone at work. I thought I was in control, but control is an illusion when you're dealing with someone like Daniel. That night, as I was tidying the kitchen, I heard Daniel's voice drift down the hallway. He was on the phone in his office. The door cracked just enough for his words to slip through. At first, I ignored it. I'd learned long ago that listening to his conversations only invited trouble. But then I caught one word, my name, and then another, cheating. I froze, my hand still gripping the dish towel. He was laughing, this cruel, satisfied laugh I'd never heard before. "Yeah, I've got the proof," he said. "Photos, screenshots, the whole package. She won't know what hit her. Judge will take one look, and she'll walk away with nothing." My stomach dropped. I wasn't cheating. I had never even thought about cheating. So what the hell was he talking about? I pressed closer to the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. "You should see the messages I've got lined up," he continued. "It's airtight. She'll look like a liar, a whore, completely unreliable. Once I'm done, she won't have a dime to her name. She won't even have a reputation." He chuckled again, low and venomous. "She'll be begging me to take her back, and I'll slam the door in her face." I backed away from the door, my knees trembling. Fake photos. Fake messages. He was fabricating an entire affair. And it was believable, of course it would be. Daniel had connections. Money. A silver tongue. In a courtroom, it would be my word against his, and he had already stacked the deck. I imagined myself sitting in front of a judge, stammering I didn't do it, while Daniel smugly waved around doctored screenshots. And I knew exactly how it would end. I wouldn't just lose him, I'd lose everything. That was the moment it hit me. My plan wasn't just about freedom anymore. It wasn't about slipping quietly out the door, starting fresh, rebuilding in secret. It was about survival. If Daniel got to the judge first, I'd be ruined. Penniless. Discredited. Maybe even trapped in some twisted cycle where he'd dangle forgiveness over my head just to watch me crawl. No, I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't just run anymore. I had to flip the plan. All night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. If Daniel thought he was the puppet master, pulling all the strings, then I had to become the ghost behind the curtain. I had to be smarter, faster, more ruthless than he ever imagined I could be. Because this wasn't about leaving quietly anymore. This was about beating him at his own game. The plan shifted in my head, piece by piece. I wouldn't wait until he left for work. Too predictable. I wouldn't just vanish. That would leave the door open for him to spin whatever story he wanted. I had to gather leverage. Something that would not only free me, but shield me from whatever proof he thought he had. For the first time, escape wasn't enough. I needed insurance. The next morning, Daniel was all smiles at breakfast. He poured me coffee, kissed the top of my head, and talked about weekend plans like nothing had happened. And I smiled right back. I laughed at his jokes. I played the perfect wife, just like always. But inside, something had changed. I wasn't the ghost anymore. I wasn't the prisoner. I was the escape artist, and I had just found the one thing more powerful than his control. The truth he didn't know I had. Because here's the thing Daniel never realized. When you live with someone like him, when you study their every move, memorize their habits, log every detail in your mental journal, you see things. You notice cracks. You pick up pieces they think are invisible. And Daniel? He had cracks. Big ones. That's when I knew I wasn't just going to run. I was going to turn his whole game inside out. The morning of my escape didn't look like a prison break. It looked like a wife going to the grocery store. I slipped on my coat, grabbed my purse, and kissed Daniel on the cheek. He grunted something about picking up milk on my way back, and I smiled like I always did. But inside, my heart was pounding. Because this wasn't just another trip to the store. This was the moment I'd been digging toward for months. Instead of turning left toward the supermarket, I turned right. Every block I drove away from that house, the air felt lighter. The leash he'd tied around my life loosened, inch by inch. By the time I pulled into the courthouse parking lot, I felt like I could finally breathe. I walked in clutching my hidden folder, the documents I'd stashed behind the basement tile, my journal of memories etched into my brain, every shred of proof I could gather without tipping him off. My hands shook as I signed the papers. Filed for divorce. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else do it. But when the clerk stamped the forms and slid them back to me, I realized this was real. This was happening. I hadn't just fantasized about freedom. I had claimed it. Of course, Daniel didn't take it lying down. He stormed into that courtroom days later with his smug grin, his fancy lawyer, and his so-called evidence. He strutted like a man who thought he had already won. And then he presented it, his photos, his messages, his fabricated affair. But here's the thing about liars. They always overplay their hand. The judge studied the proof, raised an eyebrow, and asked a few pointed questions. Within minutes, the whole thing unraveled. Metadata didn't line up. Timestamps contradicted themselves. His story had holes big enough to drive a truck through. And just like that, Daniel's smug grin vanished. The spotlight shifted, and suddenly it wasn't me on trial, it was him. In the end, the judge saw through everything. My testimony about his controlling behavior, the financial isolation, the way he cut me off from friends and work, it all painted a picture. Not of a cheating wife, but of a man who had built a prison and called it a marriage. Daniel wasn't just denied his case. He was humiliated, exposed. And me? I walked out of that courthouse clean, free, dignity intact. When I told my sister what happened, she cried. She said it was like I'd tunneled through a wall of lies, Shawshank style, and emerged into the sunlight on the other side. And maybe that's exactly what it was. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't a ghost in my own life. I wasn't an inmate or a possession or a shadow. I was me. But even now, sometimes I lie awake wondering. I didn't confront him directly. I didn't give him the honesty of telling him face to face I was leaving. I played the game in secret, kept my plans hidden, and struck only when I knew I could win. Some people might call that deceitful. Some might say I should have been upfront. But if I had been, I might not have walked out alive, let alone free. So now I ask you, Reddit, ATA for secretly planning my prison break from my marriage instead of being upfront about leaving?